Hello, my name is Alexander Solozhin. I'm an RA here at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. For our War Observatory project, we're conducting a series of interviews with experts in various academic fields relevant to the war in Ukraine. In this series, we cover basic and advanced subject matters relevant to the war. We intend for these videos to be used as teaching materials for faculty and students in Canada and around the world. Joining me here today to answer a few questions regarding the war in Ukraine is Dr. Agnieszka Weinar. Agnieszka Weinar is adjunct research professor here at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. She is also EU policy practitioner supporting EU institutions in Canada. Her current research focuses on international human resources management, migrant skill management, and intersections of migration policies and labor market policies in Europe and North America. So my first question is, where have most of the Ukrainian refugees fled to? So my first question is, where have most of the Ukrainian refugees fled to?
Thank you, Alex. I'm very pleased and honored to be here with you, trying to talk about this subject, which is the Ukrainian refugees, right? The question in itself is already very complex because the reality of on the ground is very different from the flows that we have known until now in Europe. We have to remember that this is actually the first time since the World War II where we have a very big number of people, of Europeans traveling within Europe as a bigger continent, escaping the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So what we know is actually what the UN data tells us, and the UN data collected by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees are based on the numbers that are reported by the countries themselves. And this is how we know. We of course know that we are dealing with a situation where around 11 million people have been displaced, either internally or externally. We know that at least at one point in time, we were seeing nearly 7 million Ukrainian, well, I cannot say Ukrainians, I have to say people fleeing the war in Ukraine, the displaced outside of the country. We also know that similar number is displaced within the country, but we don't know for sure because, of course, the registration is very difficult. So what we know is that we have Ukrainian nationals and people who have legal grounds, who had legal grounds of stay in Ukraine, are entitled to so-called temporary protection status on the territory of the European Union, but also to similar legal status in other countries in Europe, right? So we are not only talking about European Union. And this is how we know that such people, when they registered to this status, are then counted by UN. So we know that we are talking about 1,300,000 in Poland now. We are talking about nearly 1 million in Germany. But we are also talking about over 100,000 in the UK, 140,000 in Spain, 145,000 in Turkey. And still the country that has the largest, the biggest number per capita is a tiny country called Moldova that hosts nearly 100,000 of people who moved from Ukraine. But it's still a small number. We also had the number of over 2 million people in Russia. But here we have to be very careful because, as we know, these numbers include nearly 1 million people who were possibly forced or who had no other way of escape from southern eastern regions of Ukraine. So this is where the numbers are now. I wanted also to tell you that these numbers do not really reflect the dynamic, because we know that, for example, from the beginning of the war until the 24th of August, so in the 6 months, in Poland only, we had nearly 6 million Ukrainians coming into the country, but at the same time, we had 4 million going back to Ukraine. So the flows are really huge. So people are coming, going, depending on the situation on the ground in Ukraine. And this has to be acknowledged as well. Then, of course, apart from the people who have the temporary protection status, we have to understand that we, at least in the EU, but also in Turkey, really, before the war, we already had a very big diaspora. So we are talking about over 1 million Ukrainian workers in a country like Poland, right? The same number would be in Germany. I want to recall everyone that in 2019, Poland was the country that gave out the most work permits from all of the EU, and it was 900,000, and all of them went to Ukrainian workers, right? And that was before the war. So these people do not ask for the temporary protection, obviously, because they have their own legal status that is not temporary necessarily, right? Many of them are also already the residents, the permanent residents of the European Union. So they are not in these numbers. Now we have to understand that from that group, many went back to fight. We don't know how many, really. So I would say that we are looking at the concentration of people on the east and along the western borders of Ukraine and southern borders of the Black Sea.
And what has migration been like for Ukrainian refugees? What kind of hardships have they gone through?
So the answer to this is actually related to what I was talking about in answering the previous question. So there are two things that we have to understand. This migration, this so-called refugee flow, which is basically escaping the war, is different because the legal status of Ukrainians in Europe is different. Up front, when the war started, they could basically come into the EU without any visa because Ukraine has the visa free regime with the European Union, right? So anybody with a Ukrainian passport could come to the EU as a tourist for 3 months. So they didn't need any special program, any special legal status, and they didn't need to ask for asylum when entering the EU. So that part, that legal part, was easier upfront. Then number 2 was, again, the previous migration already within at least the EU countries. So you have this very new phenomena, which is the transnational escape routes, really, where you would have for the first 2 months really of the war, people coming from other countries in the EU to pick up their family and friends at the border. So that was also important. Then, of course, I would say that what is very different and difficult is the feeling of temporality. So Ukrainians in general do not come to stay, they come to wait through the war, right? So that wasn't the plan. Whereas maybe different or other refugee groups, when they come to the EU, they come to stay. These people came to wait through. This means that they didn't have plans, they didn't have specified needs, really. They just needed accommodation, temporary accommodation, and they needed to have access to healthcare. And that was provided by the countries that accommodated them. Now, of course, when it looks like that the war will continue for a longer term, that situation has become more dire. This is why we see this huge inflow back. And as an example, on the 26th of August, you had 26,000 people entering from Ukraine to Poland, but you had 25,000 leaving, right? Because people maybe run out of money. They get the status, the temporary protection status, and then they go back to Ukraine. This gives them additional layer of insurance that if anything happens, they can still go back and they are protected. They don't need to go through the legal hurdles anymore. So the problem, I would say, is also in the sense that the majority of people who came are women with children. We know that 50% of them are highly skilled. 60% are women with children. So children made up 40% of the flow, really. So education is a big issue. Until the end of the school year, so from the invasion to June, most of these kids were in the virtual online schooling in Ukraine. So they were offered online Ukrainian school curricula. However, as of September, it looks like most of these kids will have to go to the regular schools in the countries, in the host countries, because the families are feeling the money crunch. So the women cannot really stay at home anymore and deal with the online schooling. They have to go to work, right? And this is a problem because in Poland, for example, integration policies were not that greatly developed, so Ukrainians will probably face some major challenges.
Thank you. And now moving on to the advanced questions. What policies have the states of the European Union implemented in regards to Ukrainian refugees?
Right, so the temporary protection status of the European Union was implemented very quickly in March. That was a status that already existed in the EU law, but was applied very quickly. It gives a set of work and social rights to anybody who is either Ukrainian or a member of a family of a Ukrainian citizen, but also it can be applied to people who had a permanent legal status in Ukraine before the war, and to all those who decide that, who had a legal status, but it was temporary, like for example, students, but who can prove that they cannot go back to their country of origin because of security issues. And this interpretation, well, it's easy when you have Ukrainian nationals and their families. In case of other people, it's more complex, and it actually depends on the country where people come to. In the country like Poland, Lithuania, Czech Republic, these countries, because they were really at the front line, they had to work quicker than the EU, and they created their own legal status, which is basically the same as the temporary protection. However, it only applies to Ukrainian nationals and their family members. And this law is, so what is important to understand is that the EU temporary protection has to be then translated in the local legislation, right? Whereas where you already have your own national law, which is basically the same, you don't need to do any additional legal action. So these are the policies. Now, what it means in terms of social protection, we are talking about the payments for the kids, support for accommodation, access to healthcare, and access to the labor market, of course. So this is what it is, at least in the EU. We don't know exactly what is happening in Russia. We know that there have been abnormally high numbers of citizenship acquisitions, which raises, of course, the issue of forced citizenship. That is one of the policies that Russia has been let's say, using for centuries. So we don't know really what is happening there. I don't know if I would like to add anything more to this, maybe on the fact that in some countries, the temporary support, social support actually ended this July. And it is also because many of these people who came either went back or found job or moved onwards. So as I said, the situation is very fluid.
Thank you. And what kind of policies has Canada implemented with respect to Ukrainian refugees?
So in Canada, the policy was implemented in steps, I would say. So we now we are talking about the Canada-Ukraine authorization for emergency travel. And that was specifically tailored for people who would like to escape the war, but it was implemented to help the allies in Europe and to take the pressure out of the countries that were first responders in a way. And there really the program started basically with issuing visas to come without any rights. So people who would come with this, with that visa would be able to stay for up to 3 years, but without any rights attached, which is not the way that usual Canadian policy works. So then with time, it was actually adjusted for that work permit and for the access to health, right? After the 6 months, we know that provinces do that, and it's actually the decision of the province. But also access to, interestingly enough, to the integration services. We know that in Canada, that the temporary workers do not have access to integration services such as language acquisition or support on the labor market. So it's only the permanent resident that has that. So in this sense, that program has changed, has evolved through the months. And also many things happened on the level of provinces. We know that in the Atlantic Canada, but also on the West, the provinces were much more outgoing to help these people. I also wanted to say that the program has been used by Ukrainians in Europe and in Ukraine. But again, it has been used as a sort of insurance policy. So we know that there have been over 500,000 applications. Over 200,000 were actually accepted, but 80,000 people actually came. And those who came were not necessarily the ones who directly escaped the war. This has to be very clearly said, that we are looking at people who maybe stayed in other European countries and could take the risk. And it's clear, okay, that of course there were people who also escaped the war directly, as we heard the case of students who came to study at the University of Montreal, right? We have the whole group, but this is not the norm. And it's absolutely normal because obviously Ukrainians who escaped the war want to be close to the country because they want to go back, because they have families there. They have their husbands, their fathers in the army, or unable to leave. And what more, I can say that in Canada, the support for single mothers with children is really not ideal. So we are talking about childcare, for example. So when people learn about this, they keep the decision to move here for longer. This is all I had to say on that.
Thank you so much for meeting with me and answering my questions.
Thank you.